Hello, good afternoon. You're watching Sky News at 1. In the last few minutes, it's been announced that the disgraced TV presenter Rolf Harris has died at the age of 93. Let's talk to Matthew Thompson, who joins us from the newsroom now. Matthew, this is a man who was a familiar face, a well-loved TV presenter before these allegations were made in 2017 and before he was convicted.
Yes, I mean, look, the word national treasure is often overused, isn't it? But I think it did apply to Rolf Harris. He had been part of public life in this country for several decades at the time of his rather spectacular fall from grace. He arrived from Australia into this country as a young man, had a successful singing career, television presenting, you name it. In fact, such was his success at the heart of British public life and society that his crowning glory, if you like, quite literally, was he was allowed to, the Queen sat for an 80th birthday portrait by him, which was hung in Buckingham Palace. So you can imagine when his arrest took place as part of the police's Operation U-Tree back in 2014, it was something of a shock to many people right across the country. But arrested he was as part of that police investigation into a number of high-profile figures, including the likes of Jimmy Savile. But perhaps whilst rumour had dogged characters like Jimmy Savile for some time, Rolf Harris almost was a shock to many people who just hadn't expected it. But he was ultimately convicted of a string of sexual offences against young girls, particularly one long repeated offending, let's call it that, against a childhood friend of his daughter's. But several other people, including an autograph hunter who was 15 years old, were abused by Rolf Harris. He was sentenced to nearly 6 years in prison as a result of that, and clearly he never recovered. All of his titles and awards, MBEs and the like, were stripped from him, as you might expect they would be. And in later life, he had been in long-term ill health, having finally been released from prison. But he never clearly had anything approaching a public career again, and anything he did have in terms of a public career has been well and truly disgraced by those staggering revelations.
And Matthew, this was around the time of the allegations that emerged into Jimmy Savile. There was this thing called Operation U-Tree, and his was really the highest profile arrest as a result of that operation, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. As I say, U-Tree was an investigation by police into several high-profile figures. It emerged from accusations around the likes of Jimmy Savile. But I think at the time, the greatest shock was felt in the nation because of Rolf Harris, because he had been, as I say, a national treasure right at the heart of the British establishment. And also given that much of what he'd done was aimed at children themselves. That lent something of a even greater sense of distaste to the idea that whilst he was doing that, whilst he was being held up as the cuddly children's presenter, he had a dark side. In fact, the judge at the beginning of his court case described him as having had a Jekyll and Hyde character. And clearly that proved true, because whilst he was doing all of the things that brought him into the hearts and the living rooms of the British public, at the same time he was committing some rather heinous acts against vulnerable girls. So it was an enormous shock at the time. It's almost hard to think back and put ourselves back in the mindset of what it was like then, because his name has been so tarnished in the years since. But at the time, it was extraordinary that this man, Rolf Harris, that so many people knew and loved, was potentially guilty of such extraordinary acts. But guilty he was, and as I say, that left an everlasting stain on his legacy.
And Matthew, throughout these charges, and of course they are very, very serious charges, we did see his family, his wife, still staying by his side.
Yes, he did. I mean, he was married, as I say, with a daughter. His daughter's friend had actually been one of the victims. But it was notable that throughout much of his trial, his wife, as you see there in the pictures, stood by his side, and in fact his final days were spent living with his wife, who was a sculptor by the name of Alwyn, and she had always stood by him through thick and thin, in spite of all these extraordinary allegations, in spite of stints in prison, and as I say, the disgrace to his reputation publicly. It clearly personally didn't have as devastating an effect on his personal relationships, and he did live, in as much as we can say, happily. He certainly continued living with his wife right until the bitter end, until the age of 93, where he has now passed away after battling a fairly serious illness.
Matthew, thank you very much for that. Well, let's just take a look back and reflect on Rolf Harris's life. Sky's Martin Brunt reports.
That air, you feel it all over your skin. It's good, and that sort of feeling you want to give somebody a big hug like that, or one of those little pats makes you feel good.
Warning kids about paedophiles. When he made this educational video, Rolf Harris had been abusing children for many years.
And it's that sort of touching I want to talk about today, because it helps you to understand the sort of touching that doesn't make you feel too good.
As an entertainer, Harris built his hugely successful career on his appeal to children, but whole families admired his many talents.
You're okay with the smell of turpentine, I hope?
He was welcomed everywhere. Harris used his popularity as a cover.
Children loved him, and parents were happy to leave their children with him because they thought they were safe. And that's a perfect way to operate from the view of a child abuser, because they're able to get the child by themselves, which is important, obviously. And because the child will be in awe of them, they're most unlikely to say anything.
Harris was 84 by the time his crimes caught up with him. He was jailed for sex assaults on young girls. One of them was 7 years old. His wife Alwyn stood by him. So too his daughter Bindi, though her childhood friend was one of his victims. Publicist Mark Borkowski said Harris's crimes will overshadow his successful career.
People will remember him as an entertainer, remember to a certain time, for a period of time, he was unique, that he actually lived in the hearts of the nation, and also was pretty good at reinventing himself. You know, he took to the main stage at Glastonbury, became one of those, guilty pleasures for the rock and roll world. But he will be remembered, unfortunately, for his crimes.
Kids and water, they love it. Rivers, canals, even the lily pond in the garden.
His was a dazzling career. His fall from grace, spectacular. Harris spent 3 years in prison. He never publicly admitted his crimes, dismissing his victims as seekers of fame and money. Martin Brunt, Sky News.
Well, let's return to our correspondent, Matthew Thompson. And Matthew, Martin Brunt referred to it there, the fall from grace. It was spectacular, wasn't it? Because he was such a loved figure publicly.
Yes, as I say, right at the heart of the British establishment, portraits that he'd done of the Queen hanging in the palace. This was someone who was really, and again, I said at the beginning, the words national treasure are overused, but if it applied to anyone, it applied to Rolf Harris before his, as you say, spectacular fall from grace. And I think, when you draw comparisons, as inevitably comparisons will be drawn with the likes of Jimmy Savile, not least because they shared, similar roles in terms of being public prominent children's television presenters, but also the fact that they were both involved in the same police investigation, Operation U-Tree, into prominent figures. Comparisons will rightly be drawn between the two, but what differentiates them is that whilst in the case of Jimmy Savile, for example, there had long been rumour and speculation about the fact that he was perhaps in some way a less savoury character than was being let on. I think genuinely when it came to Rolf Harris, there was an extraordinary amount of surprise because he was someone who had appeared whiter than white. And I think it is telling, again, to quote the judge's words in his case, first court case, after he was arrested in around 2014, saying that he was a Jekyll and Hyde character. And that was very much evident in the fact that publicly, until his arrest, he had been whiter than white. He had been in the nation's living rooms, children right across the land, myself included, had sung his songs, Timey Kangaroo and Down Spot, and Waltzing Matilda, all of these classics that had really made their way into British children's folklore. And then to find that whilst doing all of that, he had been guilty of some of the most heinous crimes imaginable, serial abuse of young girls, including one as young as 7 years old. It was an extraordinary shock to the nation and will forever, quite rightly, tarnish anything approaching a legacy that he has.
Matthew, thank you very much for that, for bringing us all those details. Well, still to come on Sky News at 1. Rolf Harris, his family have released a short statement. They say that he died peacefully, surrounded by family and friends, and has now been laid to rest. That from the family of Rolf Harris, who, it was announced a short while ago, died at the age of 93, a former television star who experienced a complete fall from grace after being jailed of 12 counts of indecent assault involving victims as young as 7 or 8.